Everybody, hopefully you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, look, welcome to our annual Oman State Budget update for 2022. My name is Stuart Chakrelli. I lead our tax practice here in Oman and the UAE, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session today, which I hope you will find informative. As you know, this is an annual session that we do. Obviously, in these uncertain times, we've had to take this online, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do this face to face. But I hope everybody's keeping well and keeping safe in the current climate. What I'm going to do is pass you over to Ashok Hariharan, who most of you know, and he will be leading us through the session today. And he'll also take you through some of the key admin points up front. So with that, Ashok, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Good morning, everyone. Wish you all a very happy and hopefully once the Omicron wave eases, a corona-free 2022. This is the second year due to the pandemic that we are holding this budget event as a webinar. While I prefer an in-person event, the webinar format has the advantage of allowing many more people to participate, including many from outside Muscat and indeed outside Oman. I'm glad that you all found time to join us for this popular budget event hosted by KPMG. Before we begin, a few administrative matters. You may send your questions through the Q&A tab on the right side. We will address them during the Q&A session. May I please request you not to wait for the presentation to end to post your questions. After the webinar, please take a minute to complete the survey. Your comments are always valuable to us. Finally, a note to say that we are recording this session and the recording will be shared with you after the event. Let's now look at the agenda. We will begin with an economist's insights on the Oman economy. That will be followed by an analysis of the preliminary results for 2021 and the budget for 2022. We will also discuss some of the enablers for economic growth based on the experience of other countries. After the concluding remarks, we will have the Q&A session. Let me now quickly introduce the speakers to you. I will provide more details about them before their respective sessions. We are honored to have His Highness Dr. Adam Al Saeed with us. He is an assistant professor of economics at the Sultan Qaboos University. We will have the privilege to have his insights on the economic outlook for Oman. Abha Lekak, our indirect tax leader, will take us through Oman's preliminary results for 2021 and the 2022 budget. Mohit Basin leads our economic development advisory practice in India. Having worked with us in Oman and in the region, he will share his perspectives on some of the important enablers that could help Oman accelerate the economic growth in Oman. One of the important areas identified for diversification of revenues is the logistics sector. We will have Mohsin Al Rustam, CFO of the Asiat Group, which has the responsibility to develop Oman into a global logistics hub, join us for the Q&A session along with the other speakers. Let's now go to the first session and hear from His Highness Dr. Adam, his take on the Oman economy and the future prospects. Dr. Adam, as I said earlier, is an assistant professor of economics at the prestigious Sultan Qaboos University. He was awarded his master's degree from the New York University and his PhD from the University of Western Australia. His postgraduate research focused on the economic integration of the GCC countries. Recently, he has been involved in advising on policy initiatives relevant to the development of small and medium enterprises in Oman. He's also engaged in business and economic consulting for SMEs and other entities through his private company, The Firm. Please welcome His Highness Dr. Adam Al Said.
Good morning. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much, Ashok, for that kind introduction. And thank you very much for KPMG Lower Gulf for the invitation to join this very productive session. I've had the privilege of being involved a couple of years ago, and I found the exercise very useful and very insightful. I hope today, inshallah ta'ala, to be able to give a very brief but I would say macro perspective of Oman's economy since 2021, and in some cases looking forward to 2022 developments, inshallah. Can we start with the slides, please, Balmar? So with respect to my talk, I'm going to basically focus on three key elements: looking at the current economic conditions, previewing some of the economic indicators I believe are worth looking at and provide us with good signals for the past year and for 2022 as well, and briefly reflecting on the future prospects in a long-term perspective for Oman at the end. Next slide, please. So if we were to think about the Omani economy in the last few years, some of the key drivers that have been affecting the Omani economy, specifically in the short term and with fallout to the medium term, are energy prices, which often play a critical role as the Omani economy is dependent on oil and gas, not only to drive government finances, but to affect the economy in the rate of about 40 to 45% directly and indirectly. Fiscal consolidation has been a key part of Oman's story since the collapse of oil prices in 2015 onwards. The fiscal policies have dramatically changed and became reformist, and we've seen significant changes, and it has impacted fiscal policy and outcomes, as I will discuss a little bit later. We also see that there are positive signals driving the economy since the latter half of 2020 and 2021, and we can see that potentially flowing into 2022 with economic recovery building up quite nicely in most cases. Now, all of this is driven by economic plans and policies. Next slide, please. Now, the story of the oil recovery since the latter part of 2020 has been most important for the Omani economy in its path to recovery to the pre-pandemic era. Now, the better part of the quarterly output in 2020 has been falling and negative. Oman ran into a recession in the first half of 2020, but we've seen positive recovery soon after, especially with the oil prices picking up. And this could be seen with first the oil prices picking up back to their normal levels, but also production responding even after the OPEC agreements have held true for the better part of 2021. What does 2022 hold for us at the moment? It is clear that Oman wants to go back to 1 million barrels per day production, which means it could generate revenue considerably higher. Estimates range for the oil price itself between 70 to 80, if not more, but one would like to be more conservative and perhaps stick to the EIA's estimates of $70 per barrel. And this contrasts significantly with the budget, as we'll see later, which budgets for $50 per barrel as well. However, the increase in production, if no changes happen in the OPEC agreements plus, and a viable price of 70 could give us positive results moving into 2022. Next slide, please. Now, the recovery of oil prices and the production as well, going back to its normal levels, has meant that the budget itself was able to rebalance itself through this externality of positive or higher oil prices. However, let's not forget that there were significant reforms, including taxes such as the VAT, excise tax, improving tax collection as well. But the key element for 2021 was the improvement in oil prices, the controls and fiscal controls placed by the government that were enacted, part of the Tawazun program. This meant that the fiscal deficit of 2.4 billion Omani riyals budgeted for 2021 has actually not been realized. At the earlier preliminary numbers would tell us it has declined by about 46% or so, which leaves it at about 1.2 billion Omani riyals, which is significant and probably had impact on the ratings of the country that we've seen change in the last quarter of 2021. One of the things that we notice as well is, although the revenues have increased, sort of budgeted expenditures were caused by climatic events such as cyclones and the mitigation of the COVID pandemic, buying vaccines and providing healthcare and all of the preventative measures as well. So we've had increases in the revenues, but we've also seen some increases in spending. However, I believe there's a positive story here with the deficit falling significantly, meaning the need for borrowing has significantly fallen down for 2021 at least. Moving, please. Now, within this context of changing economic conditions and health conditions and pandemics, Oman is still anchored to long-term and medium-term economic policies. And perhaps the most important of these is the vision, which is a long-term vision which launched in 2021 that sees Oman develop and become a more advanced economy based on improving competitiveness, maintaining the environment, devising better human capital, investing more in communities, as well as creating more or better governance structures for the government and society as well. The vision itself is divided on several development plans. Oman currently launched its 10th five-year development plan, which is more specific to sectoral developments and selected promising productive sectors such as tourism, logistics, mining, fisheries. All these exportable sectors are being invested heavily through the tools of state-owned enterprises and foreign direct investment in some cases. The annual budget itself becomes the operational plan for these five-year development plans, and the budgets themselves highly interactive with three key policy tools at the moment: the medium-term fiscal consolidation plan, Tawazun, the economic stimulus plan launched in late 2020 and 2021 that will see through a lot of support, especially for SMEs and smaller businesses that have been affected by COVID lockdowns or the supply chain logistical challenges, as well as a loss of markets internationally. But in my opinion, most importantly, what Oman has done is work on the social safety net, which has transformed the way we think about subsidies in the country and reforming subsidies, as well as providing coverage through welfare and housing as well. All of these policies are fundamental in the way we think of Oman moving forward, but had significant impact in the short run as well. Next slide, please. Having looked at the economic drivers, it is worth looking at some of the key indicators as outcomes, either directly or indirectly related to those economic drivers. Next slide, please. So perhaps the one that always catches attention of headlines is output and economic growth. And here I look at the short-term changes through quarterly GDP outputs. These are in nominal values or current values, so they are subject to change if we think about inflation. But more importantly, since Oman is driven highly by prices and the productivity of the economy is very well linked to that, we can see a lot of variability over the past 2 years. Since 2019 and the decline into 2020 of quarterly GDP, we've seen a nice recovery in the latter half of 2020. And then later on, good strong growth in 2021 in terms of recovering back to pre-COVID levels. However, this particular process or pattern is not very stable. It is very sensitive to a lot of factors, and mostly exogenous or external to the Omani economy. But despite that, I believe that the stimulus plans and the government prudential measures have helped Oman in 2021 recover to pre-pandemic levels, at least at a quarterly level. Now, what does the future hold in 2022? It is hard to estimate that, but trends would suggest that that is going to be a stable growth, but not particularly high. Can we go back to that slide, please? Thank you very much. So I would believe the takeaway here is that the economy is still driven highly by the oil price volatility. Stable prices are going to be very important here. However, we seek to have more non-oil GDP growth, which would only come through the efforts and the policies that support those sectors as well. Next slide, please. Now, one of the issues that we need to keep in our mind in 2022 is the creeping inflation that comes and is a concern in many economies. For Oman, as an importing country, many of the raw materials are imported from overseas, besides oil and gas and some of the other raw materials. And what we've seen from the IMF's commodity index is substantial increase in the last year in prices of commodities, which means that we're seeing producer prices pick up. And we've also seen consumer prices also pick up as well. And some of these are beginning to be felt. And we're in the range of annual inflation rate of about 3% between 2020 and 21. And that is potentially going to flow over into 2022. So can we provide any particular policy solutions? Oman's exchange rate is pegged to the dollar. Therefore, the interest rates cannot be used in a way to protect the economy against inflation. Potentially, the social safety net may play a role here, and government support perhaps may play a role. Next slide, please. Labor markets have been very volatile over the past few years. Since the pandemic started in 2020, there's been significant reduction in the overall labor force. There were layoffs for Omanis, and there were exodus, if one may describe it, for foreigners who no longer had jobs in the local economy. However, we see the numbers stabilizing. Positive indicators on unemployment as well are coming through, as government has worked very hard at providing jobs for nationals as well, which still remains the issue and the challenge over the next few years. Next slide, please. Oman has focused highly on SMEs as a tool for economic diversification and job creation. Interestingly, we've seen a significant growth between 2020 and 21 in terms of number of registered SME companies. And perhaps this was driven largely by the support and the stimulus plans that the government had directed towards these enterprises specifically, through debt reductions or restructuring, through deferments of taxes and fees, as well as emergency finance. These were some of the tools that were directed towards SMEs specifically during 21, and we'll see them through 2022 as well. Next slide, please. Now, since oil prices have collapsed in 2020 and then picked up nicely in 21, and we hope that it will stabilize in 2022, we see that the foreign trade has stabilized for Oman. Oman still has a current account deficit, which was a concern for the Omani Riyal exchange rate with the US dollar, the peg. But the results that we see in the earlier part of the first 3 quarters of 2021, give us positive signs that there is rebalancing of the trade balance, which is critically important for Oman. However, interestingly, after a fall in imports, that picked up again, which is a sign that economic activity is coming back again. So the margins that we've seen in terms of the trade surplus are probably going to normalize in 2022. More importantly, non-oil exports tend to be relatively flat over the last year. And what we would like to see is potentially for that green line to pick up more, and the diversification efforts may very well support that. Next slide, please. Now, one of the critical components for Oman's economy from the macro level is obviously stability of its exchange rate. That is an anchor for inflation. That is a critical component for exporting oil and also for imports as well. And one would say a positive sign over the last year is the stability in the reserves for the central bank, which in the third quarter rather of 2021 have increased positively above 7 billion Omani riyals. And that is a good indicator for the ability of the economy to import, but also to stabilize the peg exchange rate as well. Next slide, please. From a monetary perspective, we see that there is improvements in credit and deposit rates, although the growth rates have slowed down. The interest rate spreads remain relatively the same over the last couple of years between the lending rates and deposit rates. Now, the key concern here is what would happen to these rates and these spreads once the US starts to increase its interest rates, and Oman would have to follow, and the base rate or the repo rate in Oman would have to pick up as well, and that may pose some challenge to the banking sector generally. However, having said that, the banking sector's liquidity is still sufficient, as international reports and local reports would guarantee. But additionally, the banking system still has liquidity that is unused in the system in the range of about 10 or 15% or so from the rates that the central bank has set. So in terms of liquidity, at least, I personally believe there is still some room there to be engaged with for productive purposes. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of future prospects, much of what I spoke about earlier really falls into what would happen to the Omani economy in the medium term. So we're talking about between 2021 or 2 all the way to 2025, which is pretty much the tenure of the 10th development plan. Different estimates would tell us that the Omani economy may grow between 2.7% to 3.5% in real terms. And these trends are projected here in this picture. And if, and that's I wouldn't say a particularly big if, but if all of the policies between the medium-term plan, the fiscal plan, the stimulus, and the 10th year development or 10-year development plan fall into place, we could see the Omani economy exceeding its output over the next few years compared to the previous decade. Now, this is subject to a lot of caveats, but what we see, whether we look at the IMF estimates or historic trends or the estimates based on the development plan, there isn't much variability there. So key factors, I believe, moving forward is having those growth drivers for the long term come into place, such as stable macroeconomic conditions, having impactful economic diversification. And when I say impactful, I mean that the sectors that have more value added would actually be more participatory in the economy and be able to add value in terms of jobs and opportunities. But one of the key drivers, I believe, for the medium to long term is definitely the policies, the transition policies, the reforms, the governance, the institutional capacity for the government and the Omani society to deliver on those promises for the next 5 years or so. So this is kind of a brief overview of the macro conditions in Oman from the short term and looking into the medium term and potentially into the long term. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was useful.
Your Highness, that was an excellent, insightful, and lucid commentary on the Oman economy. May I request participants to send the questions? We can review them over the next half an hour and in time for the Q&A session. Having got an understanding of the economic trends, let's now go to the eagerly awaited budget session, which will be presented by our partner Abha Lekak. Abha is responsible for the indirect tax practice and has been with us for almost 4 years. Before coming to Oman, she helped several companies in India with their GST implementation. Last year, she successfully helped companies and groups in Oman with their excise tax and VAT implementation. Abha, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Ashok. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sabah al khair. Thank you for joining us today. Before we dive into Oman's performance in FY21 or the expectations from FY22, let's step back and look at how the global economy evolved through the troughs of 20 to the peaks of 21. According to the World Economic Outlook published by the International Monetary Fund in October 21, after a sharp contraction of -3.1% in 2020, the world's GDP recovered to 5.9% in 21 and is estimated at 4.9% in 22. The reduction in 22 is attributable to ongoing supply chain challenges, low economic growth in lower income and developing countries due to the pandemic, and concerns over the new mutations. In the Middle East and Central Asia, after a contraction of minus 2.8% in 2020, the GDP is expected to bounce back to 4.1% in 21 as well as 22. The theme of contractions in 20 and recovery in 21 and 22 is also consistent across the United States and India. The only exception is China, where even if low, the GDP remains positive from 2020 through to 2022. So far as Oman is concerned, according to the guide to the budget for FY22, after a contraction of minus 2.8% in 2020, the GDP in 21 was 2.5%, and in 22 is also expected to be 2.5%. If one were to compare the GDP in the GCC countries, according to IMF, in 21, Saudi recorded the highest GDP at 2.8%, followed by Oman at 2.5%. And in 2022, Saudi is again projected to record the highest GDP at 4.8%, with Oman as the lowest amongst all 6 countries. On the next slide, we'll look at Oman's performance in 21. But before we look at the quantitative and qualitative aspects of some of the broad themes that was just presented, let me remind the audience that this was on the back of 2020, the year that caused disruptions globally and in Oman. His Majesty Sultan Haitham bin Tariq and his government took reins of this country when Oman's and Arab world's longest serving ruler of 50 years had passed away. COVID-19 pandemic struck the world, borders closed, travel was restricted, lockdowns were imposed, global trade was disrupted, businesses suffered, economy shrunk, unemployment increased, credit ratings were close to junk, fiscal deficit had increased, the debt to GDP ratio shot up, and borrowings became difficult and expensive. In the midst of all of it, His Majesty Sultan Haitham bin Tariq and his government took some bold, decisive, often not so populist steps to try and get the economy back on track. You had long-term measures in Oman's Vision 2040, 4 core themes, 12 national priorities, 68 measurable performance indicators, restructuring and merger of ministries to build efficiencies, transfer of ownerships in state-owned enterprises to Oman Investment Authority for better management and governance, retirement policies to allow youth better opportunities, job security systems. After the long-term measures, there was also focus on medium-term measures, which are articulated in the medium-term fiscal plan and development plan. And there were immediate or short-term measures with cuts in approved budgets, administrative expenses, reduction of subsidies. So how did Oman fare? Let's look at the preliminary results on this slide. The total revenue for 2021 was 10.9 billion Omani Riyals. This is 27% higher than the budget for 2021. Oil revenue that was originally budgeted at 3.5 billion Omani Riyals assumed a production of 967,000 barrels per day at an average price of $45 per barrel. If you look at the preliminary results, the oil production was at 957,000 barrels per day at an average price of $61 per barrel, which translated into revenues of 5.5 billion Omani Riyals. That's 56% higher than the budget for 2021. The increase, as is evident, was because the budget for 2021 assumed oil prices at $45 per barrel, whereas the actual oil price was at $61 per barrel. Gas revenues, which were budgeted at 1.8 billion Omani Riyals, in actual were 2.6 billion Omani Riyals. That's 41% higher than the budget for 21. That increase was because high oil prices pushed up gas prices, and the export of liquefied natural gas for Oman also increased. If we look at the expenditure, the total expenditure for 21 was 12.1 billion Omani Riyals. That's 12% higher than the budget for 21. Now, the expenditure related to 3 major heads, that's civil ministries, defense and security, and servicing public debts. Collectively, it was budgeted at 8.1 billion Omani riyals. These three heads account for 76% of the total expenditure, and the actuals were not far off at 8.2 billion Omani riyals. So there's just a nominal increase. It's the expenditure that was related to procurement of gas that increased significantly, because in 2021, the government continued to cover oil and gas sector related expenses, while Energy Development Oman, which is also known as EDO, was in the process of being set up. EDO, as you may know, is the company set up to operate Block 6 that contributes to bulk of Oman's hydrocarbon production. In addition to exploration and production, EDO is also tasked with investing in the energy sectors, renewables, alternate energy resources, and related trends and technologies. Now, because of this expenditure related to procurement of gas, originally budgeted at 780 million Omani riyals, the actuals were actually 1.7 billion Omani riyals. That's a 127% increase. But despite of all of this, overall, the deficit for 2021 was at 1.2 billion Omani riyals, which is 45% lower than the originally budgeted deficit of 2.2 billion Omani riyals, which is still a positive. If we look at the next slide, it lists some of the key initiatives from 2021. In terms of tax reforms, in keeping with the revenue diversification initiatives of the medium-term fiscal plan, starting 16th April 2021, Oman implemented VAT in a phased manner, starting with mandatory registration of businesses with annual supplies in excess of 1 million Omani Riyal on the 16th of April. It then gradually extended to businesses with annual supplies in excess of 250,000 Omani Riyals. Now that is imposed on supply and import of all taxable goods and services, and currently is at a modest rate of 5%. But the GCC has recently seen a trend where Saudi increased the rate of VAT from 5% to 15%. Bahrain most recently increased it from 5% to 10%. While a VAT rate hike in Oman is not on the cards at the moment, given the precedent in the region, the possibility in the future cannot be ruled out. At the same time, as a part of the economic stimulus plan, the government also afforded some tax reliefs for tax years 2020 and 2021, including a reduction of tax rate from 15% to 12% for small and medium enterprises, a rebate of 1% to all taxpayers, which was capped at 10,000 Omani Riyals, and a set-off and indefinite carry forward of tax losses of 2020. Development of small and medium enterprises was also an important initiative. Over 800 loan repayments worth 4 million Omani Riyals were waived. Over 600 emergency loans worth 3.3 million Omani Riyals were offered to Riyada cardholders. Installments of over 2,000 beneficiaries worth 8 million Omani Riyals were deferred under the former Rafad Fund. Social protection initiatives included the duration of benefits offered by job security system being extended. So as of 30th September 2021, total count of beneficiaries from the system was over 10,000 at a cost of 22 million Omani Riyals. The list of food items zero rated for VAT purposes was also increased from 93 to 488. Enhancement of government companies' performance. We have the Rawabat program aimed at improving corporate governance of Oman Investment Authority affiliated companies. That's pretty much all government companies except EDO, Energy Development Oman, or Petroleum Development Oman. The governance charter, which was aimed at regulating activities of Oman Investment Authority affiliated companies and linking their strategies with sustainable development plans. In-country value program aimed at promoting the development of domestic industry, allowing preferential price of up to 20% for new products developed and manufactured locally, preferential price of up to 10% for Omani products. The next slide summarizes some of the highlights of the preliminary results of 2021. One of the performance indicators has been credit ratings and outlook. And if we go to the detailed slide, we'll see that Fitch's credit rating for Oman in 2019 was BB plus with a stable outlook. In 2020, this was downgraded 2 notches to BB minus with a negative outlook. In 2021, while the rating remained the same, that's BB minus, the outlook was revised from negative to stable. In that, Fitch assumes that in 2022, Oman's GDP will grow by 3.1%, Oman's fiscal deficit will decline to 1.6% of the GDP. Moody's credit ratings for Oman in 2019 was BA1 with a negative outlook. In 2020, this was also downgraded 2 notches to BA3 with a negative outlook. In 2021, while the rating remained the same, the outlook was revised from negative to stable. A change in outlook reflects the significant easing of government liquidity and external financing pressures, which is owing to the ongoing implementation of the medium-term fiscal plan and significantly higher oil prices since the middle of 2020. Moody also expects Oman's debt to GDP ratio to reduce to 60% by 2024. S&P's credit ratings for Oman in 2019 was a BB with a stable outlook. In 2020, this was downgraded 2 notches to B plus with a stable outlook still. In 2021, while the rating remained the same, the outlook was revised from stable to positive. This change in outlook is attributed to Oman's robust response to the economic and health challenges posed by the pandemic, steps taken as a part of the ongoing implementation of the medium-term fiscal plan towards financial sustainability, recovery in oil prices, and the decline in consequences of the pandemic. S&P expects Oman's fiscal deficit and debt to GDP ratio to reduce over the next 3 years. If the fiscal performance continues to improve, the rating could also be raised over the next year. Now, going back to the summary slide, public spendings. Public spendings, if we see on the detailed slide, has also consistently declined over the last few years, and at 12.2 billion Omani Riyals in 2021 was at its lowest in the last 5 years. If we go back to the summary slide, we'll see debt to GDP ratio is also one of the performance indicators. And on the detailed slides, we see a comparative analysis between the GCC countries. You'll see that Oman, after Bahrain, has the second highest debt to GDP ratio in the GCC. Oman's debt to GDP in 2020 was at an 81%. In 2021, this was projected at 83%, but was limited to an impressive 68%. In 2022, this debt to GDP ratio is budgeted at 62%. All of these contributing to registering the lowest fiscal deficit since 2014, which was at 1.1 billion Omani Riyals. If we can go back to the summary slide, there are other highlights which are positives from 2021. But what does that mean for 2022? What should one expect? And if we can go to the next slide, the economic and social objective of the budget for 2022 is to maintain prudent and sustainable levels of public spending, maintaining spendings on essential, redirect subsidies to targeted low-income households, enhance contribution of non-oil and gas revenue, boost job creation, improve credit ratings and investor confidence, support small and medium-scale enterprises, prioritize projects linked to productive sectors, prioritize completion of digital transformation. So if we look at this slide, it summarizes some of the highlights of the budget for 2022. The total revenue is estimated at 10.5 billion Omani Riyals. That is 22% higher than the budget for 2021 and it is 11% higher than the budget for 2022 that was a part of the 10th five-year plan. Oil production in 2022 is estimated at a little over 1 million barrels per day at an average price of $50 per barrel, which then contributes 4.5 billion Omani riyals. That's 47% higher than the budget for 2021 and 41% higher than the budget for 2022 in the 10th five-year plan. So if this goes to plan, oil revenues will still secure 42% of the total budgeted revenue in 2022. In terms of the volumes, the existing OPEC Plus agreement, as we heard earlier, is up for review in April 2022 and may mean a change in volume assumptions. In terms of prices, oil prices are predicted to touch up to $70 per barrel in 22, but the budget and the medium-term fiscal plan factor an average price not exceeding $50 per barrel. The surplus, if any, is intended to be applied towards reducing the deficit and repaying the debts for Oman. If we look at the expenditure is estimated at 12.1 billion Omani riyals. This is 11% higher than the budget for 2021. Expenditure related to three major heads is estimated at 8.6 billion Omani riyals. That's your civil ministries, defense and security, and servicing public debt. And that comprises of 71% of the total expenditure, which shows nominal increase compared to the budgets for 2021. It is the expenditure related to procurement of gas that continues to increase significantly because of the change in the procurement strategy. This in 2022 is 105% higher than the budget for 21. Overall, the deficit for 22 is estimated at 1.5 billion Omani riyals, which is still 31% lower than the budget for 2021. The next slide dwells into the oil and gas current revenues, non-oil and gas current revenues. And as you can see, the major contributor in the 3.1 billion Omani riyals is total taxes and fees, which is 1.8 billion, of which 465 million is from corporate taxes, 450 million from VAT, and 85 million from 85 million from excise tax. Although there have been speculations, and this is an initiative under the medium-term fiscal plan, the budget for 22 does not account for any collections from personal income tax. There has been a formal announcement also confirming that personal income tax will not be introduced in 22. The next slide summarizes some of the key initiatives mentioned in the context of Budget 2020. For instance, Ijada, which is Arabic for proficiency, is an excellent system designed to measure individual performance and institutional proficiency. The system was launched on the 2nd of January 2022 and is expected to cover 175,000 employees in 57 civil units of the state's administrative apparatus and other public companies. It's expected to define employees' work tasks, build a culture of proficiency in job performance, improve performance measuring systems, and link incentives in public companies with the level of productivity. The system is amongst the main enablers for Oman's Vision 2040 and ultimately aims to improve the quality of government services, boost beneficiaries' confidence in government units, and boost the efficiency of the state administrative apparatus. Small and medium enterprise related measures continue with drafting of SME law, introducing funding regulations, Riyada card regulations, Sanat Center regulations, launching group financing platforms. There's also the emphasis on the National Register of Government Assets, which is intended as an integrated central system to take full account of government assets and draft a strategy to maximize returns. The register aims to register and determine the actual value of government assets, centralize government asset management and enhance its efficiency, identify assets for privatization, for public-private partnership, secure financial resources for the state budget. Other countries that maintain a national register usually see this as a commitment to transparency, accountability, and good asset management. In 2021, His Majesty Sultan Haitham bin Tariq also issued the decree for consolidation and management and operation of the various pension funds in Oman into two funds, the Social Security Fund and the Military and Security Services Pension Fund. Now, the idea of this is to ensure that there are significant investments managed, a consolidation of the significant investments which are being managed independently to create a comprehensive social protection coverage, have a unified methodology for investment management, and enhance investment capacity and efficiency. The next slide talks about projects which are also being financed outside the budget. And these are approximately investments worth 5 billion Omani riyals, which are financed through finance agencies, public-private partnership, Oman Investment Authority affiliated companies. Out of the 5 billion, 2.9 billion is through Oman Investment Authority in sectors largely prioritized by Oman's Vision 2040. And if you see, there are multiple sectors which are where investments have been allocated, but between energy and services itself, there's about 2.2 billion worth of allocations, which is 76% of the total planned investments. The aim is to fuel the growth of priority sectors and also improve the investment environment. There are also spendings worth 1.2 billion Omani riyals by Energy Development Oman in the energy sector and 0.9 billion Omani riyals in the development budget. So those were the highlights of the preliminary results of 21 and the budget of 22. That's it for me from now. Back to you, Ashok.
Wow. So many things to look out for during 2022. And what a significant turnaround Oman achieved during 2021. Can this upturn be continued during 2022 and beyond? To address this question, it is important to understand the enablers that would accelerate economic growth in Oman. We have for the next session Mohit Bhasin, a partner with KPMG India. Mohit leads our Global Economic Growth Network. He has advised several governments over the last 2 decades on their economic development and job creation programs. His clients include the governments of India, Saudi Arabia, UK, Canada, and multilateral development banks such as the World Bank. Mohit, over to you.
Thank you, Ashok, and a very good afternoon to everyone who have joined us on the call. Let's begin the next slide, please. So over the past couple of minutes, you have heard from various panel members that how the overall economic outlook is changing and how the budget has been a milestone event, especially when we are talking and turning our economy to a post-COVID era. The budget has certainly delivered significant message for the global community, and please allow me to share some outside-in view as I have had the privilege of working with multiple geographies, especially in the Gulf region, and bring some perspective. What's changing? Oman has certainly demonstrated a positive outlook towards the business community, especially from the FDI attractiveness perspective. By liberalizing the sectors, by allowing foreign companies to come and invest in Oman, the entire initiative around the incentivization of public-private partnership, especially in sectors such as education, health, housing, is a very welcome step. And another big initiative is around the 10 domestic sectors, which are currently under focus, especially from the diversification perspective, is certainly a very welcome move. And I will talk about the use cases or the examples of how a very close competing economies have leveraged this opportunity, which possibly could be a takeaway from the today's session. Now, talking about positioning, this is the key phrase when it comes to any country trying to position its competitiveness to the global business community. And what is good news here is that right from all the 3 leading rating agencies from the credit outlook perspective has given a positive indication. Whether we talk about S&P, Fitch, or Moody, as my colleague Abha talked about, it's certainly a very, very welcome move. Vision 2040, which is what we all are aiming towards right now, giving a clear KPI-based growth indicators, which are in the form of different global indicators, has been articulated, is a very milestone-based target. It's not that vision is just overarching, but it is giving a clear direction to the implementing agency and also the outside world to see that how things are progressing. And another very big initiative, which I will also talk about in my subsequent slide, is the digitization initiative, the digital transformer. And I have a firm view that digital transformer can bring a multiplier effect when it comes to the economic growth. And we'll talk about that more. But let me just spend a few minutes in terms of what's changing in the global landscape, especially when it comes to businesses are looking at their landscape. COVID is now, I would say, we are getting into the third phase of COVID, and a lot of companies are now deciding or designing their so-called the post-COVID strategies. So FDI rebalancing is the biggest thing we are noticing as we speak. Now, what is changing in this case? The traditional, if I may say, the pre-COVID era, there was a clear focus of outsourcing, setting up an offshore manufacturing or services location in a very limited geographies. But now, given that COVID has given us a lesson in terms of that supply chain can be disrupted and a lot of dependencies has to build in-house. So localization is becoming a new norm, which means certain product segments or certain services which are necessary for us to keep our day-to-day business or life going on are becoming local. So companies are trying to retain that, and most importantly, what is continuing, wherein countries are now talking about creating their in-house capabilities of manufacturing, keeping in view what a global value chain demands for. A vertical integration is becoming the new norm. So when I say vertical integration, whatever any country is now talking about manufacturing in their home location, they are trying to see that are they manufacturing everything when it comes to the vertical integration, so that the dependency of, for example, raw material or even the packaging material does not hinder the entire objective of supplying to the end consumer, which is citizen of the business. So supply chain realignment is a major disruptor, and companies are now rethinking of completely realigning their supply chain. And we will also talk about that, how logistics sector is now getting up towards making this more critical. And last but not the least, all the governments now very clearly focusing on, if I may say, a single KPI, job creation. How can each initiative, program, project, investment, can we tag that particular activity to number of jobs we are creating, and most importantly, jobs for the local citizen. So job creation is becoming a single-minded focus for many governments as we speak. So let me just move to the next part of my presentation, wherein I'll talk about some use cases of how different countries and competing economies, if I may say, have looked at these elements. And what are learnings for us from these regions? For example, ease of doing business. So I'll talk about examples from where I am currently talking is India. So India has created a very strong focus on ease of doing business close to 6 to 7 years back. And what India has done is that they started focusing on the World Bank Global Ease of Doing Business ranking. We work tirelessly in Indian government, and different departments have worked very closely for close to 3 years. And as a result, India's rank on the World Bank doing business jumped by 67 points, which is actually an historic high in the overall. Now, what has happened? This has certainly given us a positive confidence and a message to the global business community that things are changing from the ease of doing business perspective also. But at the same time, India has also launched something called as competitiveness ranking within states, so that each state, as you know, India is a large and a multi-state geography. So each state can position itself or compete amongst each other to give a better working environment to the business. Now, fast forwarding in today's era, after having done some successful initiatives around the World Bank or the state ranking, currently India has matured itself, or rather taking a next level of reforms, which we are calling it as compliance burden reduction. And this is happening at two spectrums. The first line spectrum is, can we make the life of citizen easy? So the reduction of entire burden on compliances from the citizen side, and second, which we were doing, was the business. So the entire gamut of easing the life of a citizen from the public service delivery or interacting with the government and also the business is now being converted into a spectrum called ease of living. So that's how India has been evolving every day in every way, so that the life of overall business and citizen becomes comparatively easy. Let me talk about a brief on the cost of doing business, which technically is the key differentiator or the key KPI measurable element under ease of doing business. Now, I give an example what UAE has attempted, and we have the privilege of working on both the cases. So, UAE government has made an initiative wherein they were looking at measuring the cost of doing business, especially from the perspective of setting up a business entity and running a business entity with a clear focus around manufacturing parks. And then they went out and compared their cost of doing business with the competing economies in the Gulf region. Now, having done that exercise, the country can easily understand the levers wherein the cost can be optimized, can be reduced, and in many cases can also be eliminated. So cost of doing business is a very clear and the most focused initiative I am currently seeing also in different parts of the world. Countries are experimenting so that they become much more appealing when it comes to the business. Now, moving to the another perspective around job creation and how investment and trade could be a lever for us. So let me just share with you an example around how Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has attempted in terms of moving this direction. And it's a close to a very competing economy. It's evolving. It's opening itself to the overseas markets, business, international community, purely from the globalization perspective. So what they have done, they have focused in a very similar fashion around 12 sectors, and these 12 sectors were being benchmarked across the globe, and most importantly with the immediate competing economies, that how their industrial landscape, their incentive structure, the value proposition, the competitiveness can be looked at, and how can they really improve their overall positioning in these 12 sectors. And hence, the incentive structure has been designed, the proposition have been created, and the outreach is happening when it comes to the global investors. Now, in this case, creating that very bespoke sector specific value proposition with a competitiveness perspective in view, it becomes much easier for the investor to choose A location versus B. Now, this approach will definitely help, including Oman or any other country, to be much more objective when it comes to outreach to the overseas investors specifically. Now let me switch gears to the another interesting and an important element on connectivity. And connectivity stems from two dimensions: the domestic connectivity and the international connectivity, especially the overseas. As you all know, because of COVID, we have seen a massive lockdowns. Our containers are stuck, ships have been stranded, and the entire disruption has happened because of the disruption happening in the supply chain by simply closing the borders. So a lot of innovation is happening in this space. And as we speak, a lot of companies and even the countries are talking about digital seamless access to the business purely from the trade perspective, because if you are digitally connected, things becomes much more smoother. And keeping that in view, I can even talk about a lot more examples, especially in the digital space. For example, Indian government has launched close to 6-7 years back Digital India initiative, which is overarching across the spectrum and which is creating a big difference in the way I as a citizen operate on my day-to-day basis, and I as a business person do business in the country and including the overseas market. So digitalization leading to an innovation and entrepreneurship is creating a ripple effect in any initiative which government is doing. And I just want to lay a strong emphasis why it is far easy to launch a program, a project, an initiative, which is an overarching initiative. But what sits at the essence of a success is the governance. And I can say with great confidence, the countries where we have got a chance of working, all the successful programs has been successful purely because of a strong governance. I call it as, in a consulting phrase, a program management approach of running any program, and most importantly, reviewing those programs at the highest level in the government on a much structured, on a periodic basis. And this is the key differentiator between just launching a program and successfully completing a program. The governance, how countries have institutionalized that governance, how they are running it, how they are reviewing it, and most importantly, clearing up whatever the bottlenecks that comes right from conceptualization to the execution. So that has been my experience, and I'm happy to discuss that over the next few minutes in the Q&A session. Ashok, with this, I hand it over back to you.
Thank you, Mohit. Quite a few interesting experiences you have shared on how Oman can follow the success of other countries and achieve the vision laid out in the 2040 document. You mentioned vertical integration. That is certainly happening in Oman in the downstream oil and gas sector and also in the steel industry. That leads us nicely to the concluding remarks before the Q&A session. As all speakers have said, there are three focus areas for Oman: attaining economic balance, target sustainable growth, and continue to focus on social welfare. Oman plans to achieve this through increasing non-oil revenues, rationalizing public spending, controlling deficit, thereby reducing public debt, bringing in foreign direct investments, and expanding the private sector participation. Very important, continuing support to SMEs and improving efficiency of state-owned entities. The government is also focusing on giving a big push to digital transformation and enhanced job security and social protection for its citizens. I can see a number of questions have come in and probably will come in the next 10 minutes. I would request all speakers to join us for this session, which I think will take around 20 minutes. We will also be joined for this Q&A session by Mohsin Al-Rustam, the Group CFO at the Asiad Group. Mohsin has over 15 years of experience in the logistics and maritime sectors, including 2 years at DP World's European Regional Office in London. He has in his long career spanning Asiad, Oman Shipping Company, Oman Trading International, which belongs to the OQ Group, and DP World, successfully operated and developed financial processes and systems, and equally important, managed financing, hedging, and liquidity needs of the companies he has served. Thank you, Mohsin, for joining us. If I could start,
Thank you for the introduction.
If I could start, Mohsin, by asking you a question. What are your thoughts on the 2022 budget and the role Asiad Group is expected to play in 2022 and indeed later years to achieve Vision 2040's objective of transforming Oman into a global logistics hub and accelerate economic growth?
Thanks, Ashok, for the introduction, and thanks for KPMG Lower Gulf for the invitation to participate today. From our side, from Asiad, of course, if I give you a bit of background on Asiad and the role Asiad has been playing historically since its inception, but also with the companies within Asiad which were operating within the country before the establishment of the group company Asiad as well. So Asiad, as most of you are aware, is Oman's newest integrated logistic provider. It aims and aspires to become one of the top 10 logistic hubs by 2040, in line with Oman's 2040 vision as well. We were established in 2016 to maximize the financial return and economic impact of the government's logistic investment. And as I mentioned, many of our companies under our umbrella have been there longer than 2016 or the inception of ASIAD. Today, if you look at ASIAD, we our group comprised of 3 deep ports, 3 free zones, as well as an adjacent world-class dry dock for the vessels, and also a shipping company having a fleet of larger than 60 vessels operating in various sectors. Oman is today, with its ports, with its shipping connectivity, connected to more than 500 ports globally. Out of those connectivity, we have 200 direct lines to more than 86 ports and to more than 40 countries around the world. Oman is also recently has been ranked #1 in GCC trading across border index. To answer your question as well, Ashok, on the role ASIAD can play, to diversify Oman's economy and to leverage and increase the impact of the logistic investment. If you look at, as mentioned by the panelists as well, you look at the Oman Vision 2040 and the priorities set there as well. There is a close alignment between ASIAD's strategy and Oman's Vision 2040. Out of the priorities within the Oman Vision 2040, or the 12 priorities, 7 of those priorities are aligned with ASIAD's strategy. Also, out of the 76 of the objectives within the Oman Vision 2040, there is more than 15 of those objectives very much closely aligning with ASIAD's strategy as well. ASIAD is working tirelessly now, implementing and executing its business plan, which very much aligns, as I mentioned, with the objectives of the budget 2022 on enhancing the foreign direct investment, also diversifying Oman's economy as well, and also aligning it with the Vision 2040, moving our country away from the dependency on the fossil fuel economy as well. Also, to comment on the budget as well, I can also mention a few key takeaways. Of course, the rating agencies' improvement in the outlook, although the rating still remains the same. However, the improvement in the outlook and the suggestion of a possible rating upgrade, hopefully by this year, which would be the first rating upgrade in a very long time, since I believe 2007, would very much improve the liquidity position in Oman, would open the door for us for access to cheaper liquidity, to be able to implement our projects and the execution of the business plan. Also, you can see from the budget 2022 as well, the emphasis on the economic diversification, and as I mentioned as well, the role ASIAD is playing there with the logistic spectrum as well, or the cluster, and what positions ASIAD or differentiated today than where Oman's logistic capabilities were there in the past, is the integrated logistic services. It's having everything in one bundle: the shipping, the ports, the free zones, everything bundled in one integrated logistic services and products provided to the customers, which uplifts Oman's logistic capabilities and helps to implement our vision to be one of the logistic hubs by 2040. Also, one is strong takeaway from my side as well is the sustainability and the ESG focus as well, with the investment in the hydrogen, or specifically green hydrogen and green ammonia projects in various places in Oman, as we're also aware the abundance we have in Oman in terms of the solar and wind resources. that could facilitate, of course, for the production, for the export as well of hydrogen, and having also Asyad with its free zone, with its terminal operation, as well as the shipping and transportation capabilities, very much positions it in a place where it can also help the country's very ambitious plans to enhance the sustainability and ESG profile of the country and the fossil fuel or cleaner energy transformation for the country.
Thank you. Thank you, Mohsin. If I could pose this question to Dr. Adam. We noted the positive signals emerging from the preliminary 2021 results. What areas do you believe we haven't made sufficient progress, and what could be done to address this?
Thanks, Ashok. I think we are still lagging in terms of promoting our sort of exports from Oman to the rest of the world. Manufacturing presents about 10% of contribution to GDP. It does not get the same attention in terms of internationally for Oman. The idea of made in Oman, something that Mohit had alluded to in the way of Oman has been working very hard on the investment promotion elements. And now we're moving into the made in Oman promotion part, but that is mostly internal and encouraging purchase local ideas and support local manufacturers and products. But I think it's very important while we talk to the rest of the world about investment opportunities in Oman, we should also be heavily promoting Omani products in the rest of the world. And in the past, that's been done between the Ministry of Commerce and Investment Promotion, Commerce, Industry and Investment Promotion, and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry. But in many instances, the impact has been limited to certain type of products and not the wider range of products, whether these products are inputs in other industries or they're finished goods for consumers. So I think to improve Oman's condition in terms of exportables, the non-oil exportables, there is much work to be done in promoting the products, not only the investment opportunities for Oman, which I believe in the last 18 months or so, there's been a lot of significant work being done in terms of trade delegations. But we often market Oman as a country, an investment opportunity, but let's not forget that there are great opportunities as well in terms of exportables, because that's one of the engines that we build our sort of future plans on, which depends a lot on what has been said about our logistical capabilities as well. You know, these logistical capabilities need to translate into the export channels as well as the import channels, and for industry to find it easier to access the markets that we target.
Very true. Abba, unlike the previous years, deficit is expected to be funded more out of domestic borrowings rather than foreign borrowings. What implications does this have? Abba?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
I said, unlike the previous years, deficit is expected to be funded more by domestic borrowings rather than foreign borrowings. What implications does this have?
I think I would, perhaps an economist's view is something I would seek support from, but given the credit ratings, given how the deficit has evolved over the last few years, given how the expenditure is, I think there are a lot of factors at play, and I would request Dr. Said, to please take the question.
Thank you, Abha. And Ashok, if you allow me just to chip
Please.
into that answer. Now, one of the things Oman has been building up is capacity and competency in managing its public debt. As we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, the ballooning of public debt because of oil prices and whatnot had led to significant portion, almost 80% to 85% of GDP sort of outstanding debt. But Oman, right from the start, has been very clear that it will not finance it completely from international borrowing, but there's a mixture. About 15% or so comes from local borrowing and the strategic reserves with the OIA, the Oman Investment Authority, as well as about 80 to 85% from international borrowing. But as correctly pointed out, in certain years that became more difficult and quite expensive to borrow. Now, one of the things that worries us, generally speaking, is when governments borrow domestically, they put a lot of pressure on available liquidity. And generally, governments could get favorable rates compared to international. However, having some of your debt domestically raised gives you stability in terms of repayments because it's in the same currency. So the risk of exchange rates, even though Omani Riyal is pegged to the dollar and we borrow in the dollar externally. The other element is there are positives as well in borrowing to some extent, which Oman has done before and issued some sukuk as well. The bond market in Oman is generally very shallow, and government bonds would add value there. This will open up more investment opportunities for pension funds, insurance companies, and anyone who's thinking of investing domestically in Oman. So there are positives and negatives, but Oman has been very careful not to borrow heavily domestically, not to crowd out other sources of investments for would-be investors domestically. And I believe moving on to creating the debt management office with technical support from the IMF, that has been very useful. And I should also note here that Oman has also allocated in the budget a 20,000 barrel per day allocation up to 150 million Omani Riyals debt repayment clause within the budget since 2021, which is also another tool of managing debt as well. So there are multiple elements here, but I think the budget is careful with the allocation of where the funding comes from as well. And I think a mixture is very good, but within specific bounds and very clear bounds.
Thank you, Doctor. And panelists, feel free to sort of intervene, interject. If the question is not appropriate for you, you could pass it on to others. This question is for you, Abba. Tax is an important source of revenue for the governments around the world. What role do you see tax playing in Oman? And when you elaborate on this question, please also address, I know you mentioned it in your presentation that personal income tax is not going to be introduced during 2022, but there are a number of questions raised by the participants asking when do you expect PIT to be introduced?
Sure. Thanks, Ashok. That sounds a lot like a question for me. So what role do I think taxes will play? I think personally, it will play a very critical role. If you look at data which is published by the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, even if you look at the set of OECD countries, which is a representative of more than 25, the average tax to GDP ratio is usually in the range of 33%. The highest could go as high as 46%. So even if we look at that 33%, which is a representative of a lot of economies, developing as well as developed, and then we look at how the ratios in Oman or the region compare. If we look at the 1,000 billion that is estimated in 2022 versus even if you take a GDP of 32 billion, that works out to 3%. I'm not saying that the 3% will become 33% overnight, but I do think taxes have been globally acknowledged as a measure of generating non-oil and gas revenues. And the region is increasingly seeing that and adapting to it. Look at Oman's history, or look at the region's history. At one point in time, we did not have any taxes. Then we had taxes on certain sort of companies. Then there was an increase in rate of corporate tax. Then we've seen the introduction of excise tax, now VAT. Some of the countries have now gone to double or triple the rate of VAT from 5% to 10% to 15%. So there is the need, the economic need to generate revenues. There is the international pressure to diversify. That's acknowledged through and through in Oman's Vision 2040, the medium-term fiscal plan, the medium-term development plan. That's also being seen in the initiatives. There's also pressure from global agencies like OECD to make sure that the world is a level playing field, that there's no tax haven as such, and there's no base erosion profit shifting. And if there is a country that, in a way, offers itself as a potential tax haven, even for the perception of it, there are now sanctions, there are now blacklists, there are now MLIs, and a lot of other measures which are being introduced. So I do feel taxes, whether by choice or by imposition, are going to play a very critical role in the larger scheme of things. On your question of personal income tax, yes, I did clarify during my presentation that the budget does not account for any revenues in 2022, but we shouldn't forget that one of the measures in the medium-term fiscal plan is the introduction of a personal income tax on high taxpayers. And the range of, or the period of the medium-term fiscal plan is 2020 to 2024. So although it's not happening in 2022, there's still 2 more years to go. So maybe that's the timeline we should anticipate. But we'll obviously have to wait for a more official comment coming from the tax authority or the Ministry of Finance or the government apparatus on that.
I think a follow-up question, and Dr. Adam may have other points to mention on taxes, but I have a question for Dr. Adam on personal income tax. I recall, Your Highness, 2 years back, I had posed this question to you on VAT, and VAT did come in last year. As far as personal income tax is concerned, what impact do you think such a tax could have on the economy?
Right. One of the things I think we need to frame personal income tax, and as Abha had properly associated that historically the tax sort of sentiment has always been negative in the region, as it's seen as hurting social sort of aspects and social well-being in the economy, especially in rentier economies and welfare government sort of support for the public. Now, we need to be mindful that incomes are still relatively weak, whether by comparisons to OECD or BRICS, in some cases, certain countries, the size of the economy and individual incomes. There's a heavy welfare element here that contradicts the idea of personal income tax. And if we talk about high net worth individuals or high income, again, it's a very complex thing that the Tawazun program needs to be very mindful of these complexities. Obviously, there are challenges to find these extra revenues, but to easily say that in a particular year, the personal income tax is going to come in, they have to be very careful how it's rolled out because of its social impact on disposable income. There is no clear element right now, for example, how VAT has impacted spending. We don't have those numbers to tell us. The most recent household income and expenditure survey was back 2018 and 2019, prior to the introduction of VAT. So the only way we're going to get any feel is for the next cycle of that kind of spending, or when the GDP numbers come somewhere mid 2022 with consumption and how consumption has been affected. So in my opinion, personal income tax is one that Oman needs to be very careful, and the GCC for that matter, because there are two competing issues here. Personal income tax needs to apply to all nationals and non-nationals. How do you do that fairly without hurting your competitiveness as well? That's one particular issue. The other particular issue is the tax base is still being built up. VAT was the first indicator of what kind of tax base do we have. It's a consumption tax, so it's a bigger base. But when it comes to personal income tax, it's much smaller. The cost of getting the system up and running, and as you are aware, you're tax expert, compared to the income. VAT was a challenge for 300 to 400 million riyals you would have spent about 50 million riyals, or sorry, I should correct myself, about 5 or so million riyals just to set up the system alone, besides the training and hiring and all of those issues. So I would, point out that it isn't about the decision, it's about rolling out the actual income tax in a meaningful and impactful way. So that's the big caveat, so to speak. But I'd also kind of like to highlight something with the tax that Abha had pointed out. It is not the tax haven issue that worries me as an economist, as much as it worries me whether we have tools that we can use it as fiscal policy tools. Now, taxes traditionally are a very useful tool when you want to encourage the economy and stimulate the economy, or you want to do the opposite. We've seen Saudi Arabia, for example, raise a VAT to increments of what it was to start with. That's very useful, but that has impact on spending and the economy. Now, Oman did the opposite in terms of increasing the number of zero-rated food products. So that, in a way, makes sure that we have consumption continue on, even though it gets hurt by negative economic consequences. Those tools were not available to us prior to 2021. Today, we have some tools that will be effective when the government cannot spend. It could give tax breaks. It does that with corporates. It can do that with corporates, but it can't do that with personal consumption. Now it has the opportunity to do that. And in many ways, it could also use that as a way to direct incentives and welfare incentives to those individuals with low incomes as well, in terms of specific exemptions and whatnot.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Radham. We are running out of time. There are many more questions, but I would like to leave the last word with Mohit. Mohit, I won't put any question to you, but do you want to add anything more to what has already been said so far?
Thank you so much. I think one input, if I may give it to my audience and to all of us here, is that digitization, if played well, and if I look at from the economic growth perspective, we look at from 3 lenses. The natural capital, wherein we all know what natural capital to Oman means, the human capital, and the third asset is the digital capital. And if digital capital can be in cash, because this is a non-negotiable denominator for any country to survive over the next 10, 20 years. And digitization can be a real multiplier for the economic growth if played well in the right manner by connecting both the citizens and the business, and most importantly, internally realigning all the reforms program by bringing the entire governance in place. So digital is the certainly new norm, and I thank you all of you for patient listening and opportunity. Ashok, back to you.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you very much. Your Highness, Dr. Radham, Mohsin Al-Rustam, Mohit, Abha, Stuart, and more importantly, all of you who have participated, posed so many questions. I hope you all enjoyed the presentation that has been made by different speakers. As promised, we will be sending to you in the coming day or so the recording of this event. So thank you very much once again, and have a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok, and all colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.